During World War II, most every country involved, Axis or allies, faced some sort of food rationing for its citizens on the home front. And this led to the advent of numerous interesting dishes, like this American recipe for emergency steak made with ground meat, milk, and Wheaties cereal. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we examine the American home front during World War II, this time on Tasting History. So this is going to be the first in a series of videos that I release over the next few months about the home front during World War II for various countries, and not just the Allied powers like the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, but also the Axis powers like Japan and Germany. But since I am from the US, I figured I would start at home and have the first video be from America's point of view, even though we were kind of Johnny-come-latelys when it came to World War II. We didn't even enter the war until a few years after it started, and even then we didn't start rationing food until mid-1942. It was in May of 1942 that the first ration card was distributed to all Americans, and this was focused on rationing sugar. This was followed by coffee rationing later that year, which led people to brew Roosevelt coffee, which was just weak coffee made from reused grounds. And then came the rationing of meat, dairy, cooking oils, and a whole host of canned and processed foods. And as ingredients became more and more difficult to find, publishers put out recipes designed to make rationing more bearable. And one of the most iconic of these books was Betty Crocker's Your Share: How to Prepare Appetizing, Healthful Meals with Foods Available Today. The book, published in 1943, starts off with a section on stretching meat and cautions consumers to watch your P's and Q's, points and quantities. The points being a method of buying food. Different foods required different ration points, and we'll talk more about it later, but you had to spend these points in addition to spending money to get food. So it was all about conserving your points. The cookbook gives an example of 1 pound of ground meat, which serves 4 or 5 people and costs 7 points, while the same weight of a porterhouse steak, which could only serve 2 or 3 people, would cost 12 points. So if you're running low on points, but you have a hankering for a steak, you're kind of out of luck unless you follow Betty Crocker's recipe for emergency steak. It calls for 1 pound of ground beef or hamburger, a half cup of milk, 1 cup Wheaties, 1 teaspoon salt, 1/2 teaspoon pepper, 1 tablespoon chopped onion. Place on pan, pat into T-bone steak shape 1 inch thick, broil 8 to 15 minutes at 500 degrees, very hot. Turn once. Now, I have yet to try this emergency steak, and I kind of think that it's not going to actually taste like a real steak, but at least it only costs 7 ration points instead of 12, which a regular steak would cost. Though if you have no ration points, you can always make a ration point free meal from today's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh delivers farm-fresh ingredients right to your door, and to cut down on prep time, all of the ingredients are pre-portioned so you can get right to cooking. They have an ever-changing menu of 50 recipes to choose from every week, so there's something for everyone, whether you're vegetarian, pescatarian, or just looking for something quick and easy. And you can customize your meals by swapping out different vegetables or different proteins. Like you can choose to have ground pork or ground chicken or ground turkey whenever you make this rigatoni rosa with zucchini and parmesan. That's what I had for dinner last night. It was nice and quick, super filling, and most importantly, scrumdiddlyumptious. And now HelloFresh has a lineup of different breakfast items like cinnamon crumb coffee cakes and Liège waffles. And right now you can get free breakfast for life by clicking my link in the description or visiting HelloFresh.com and using my code FREETASTINGHISTORY. You get 1 free breakfast item in every box as long as your subscription is active. That's free breakfast for life when you use my code FREETASTINGHISTORY at HelloFresh.com. Now personally, one of my favorite breakfast items, just in general, is cereal, which oddly enough is an ingredient in this recipe for steak. Specifically, it calls for Wheaties cereal. And the reason is because Wheaties was owned by General Mills. And most of the recipes in this book use different products from General Mills because, as we've covered in a previous episode, Betty Crocker was basically just a character that was created to sell the products of General Mills, or originally the Washburn-Crosby Company. The thing is, since Wheaties are a flaked cereal, I'm thinking that just sticking them into this meat combo, it will lead to a very jagged steak. So I'm assuming that they are being used as a binder of some sort, so I'm going to go ahead and crush them up. Not super fine, but fairly fine. And then I don't think it really matters the order that you mix the ingredients, but the way that I did it was I took the pepper and salt and added it to the meat, and then I added the chopped onion and mixed all of that in, and then added the Wheaties. Once everything was combined, I added the milk, and it took a minute or so of mixing, but eventually everything came together. And then once everything is together, you come to the hard part, and that is sculpting this meat into the shape of a T-bone steak. So put the meat onto a baking sheet lined with foil. You don't have to use aluminum foil. They wouldn't have used foil at that time because aluminum was scarce and there's a war on, don't you know? But I'm using foil because it's going to make it a lot easier later on. Then start to mold the meat into the shape of a T-bone steak. I think I got pretty close, though I kind of wish I had like a real T-bone steak nearby to use as a model, but I think I did fine. What is most important is that you don't make it much thicker than 1 inch. He says 1 inch, because if it is much thicker, then the ground meat on the inside is not going to cook all the way, and that would be bad. But once your T-bone steak is ready, set it in the oven under the broiler at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 Celsius, and let it broil for about 8 minutes. Then remove it from the oven and flip it. The issue here is this is not a real steak, so if you try to flip it like with a flipper of some sort or tongs, it will disintegrate. So the best way that I found to do it was to take another pan that was clean with foil, set it on top, and then flip both of them together, wearing gloves, flip both of them together, and then you flipped your steak. Then put that steak back under the broiler for another 8 minutes or so, or until the internal temperature reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as we finish browning our emergency steak in the oven, let's take a closer look at what rationing in the US was like during World War II. On December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The US was now officially part of a conflict that had been raging in Europe for over 2 years and in Asia for over 4. And almost immediately, the Office of Price Administration, which had been established only months before the attack, set in to rationing certain items to the American public. Just a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the sale of tires was cut off. At that time, 75% of all the rubber in the US was used to make car tires. But as a single battleship required over 75 tons of rubber, this meant tires on the home front were a luxury the US could no longer afford. You were actually encouraged/ordered to save your 5 best tires and sell others to Uncle Sam. But should you really need a tire, you could get one, but you had to apply and go through a long process just to be able to possibly purchase one. So it was all about conserving the tires that you did have. And this led to something known as the victory speed or war speed, which was basically a national speed limit of 35 miles an hour, which reduced wear and tear on the tires. Shortly after the tires became rationed, so too did bicycles and automobiles altogether. Any company that had been making these items instead turned to making military vehicles and munitions. Gasoline too was being rationed, and people were encouraged to join car-sharing clubs, basically carpools. One government poster from the time encouraged you to join one because when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And these weren't really optional restrictions. Today, if you are caught speeding, you'll get a ticket. But then, if you're caught speeding, you could have your gasoline ration taken away entirely, so you can't drive at all. What's interesting is that the gasoline and other fuels like coal, while very important for the war effort, were not as precious as some other items because America produced plenty of oil and coal, so they could always just make more. But there were other commodities that were not produced at home, and so they were severely rationed. Things like rubber. Most of the rubber at the time came from Southeast Asia, and as soon as the war set in, the Japanese cut off that supply completely. Another ingredient that was like that was sugar, and that's why it was the first to be rationed, because most of the sugar that the US was eating came from the Philippines. And so the only sugar that was grown at home was from places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and that was nowhere near enough to satisfy the needs of American sugar eaters. But not being able to import a certain item was just one reason that something might be rationed. There were other reasons, like the supply chain. It was very taxed at the time, and things like trucks and railroads were completely overrun transporting troops and war supplies from coast to coast. In addition, those troops being transported were usually young men who had been taken out of the workforce, so there was a huge labor shortage. And very quickly, many women stepped in to take those jobs, but it wasn't immediate, and it was kind of a game of catch-up for quite some time. Then there was the issue of feeding those troops who were no longer producing food, because not only were they taking up food, but they also took up a lot of other items that were required to get the food to them in places like Europe, Africa, and Asia. Like a lot of their food was packaged in tin cans, but the US had almost no tin. And so foods like processed foods and canned goods became extremely scarce almost overnight. Stores put up signs letting people know how their stock had decreased over the year, and processed foods were often down around 80%. So to stop people from buying up all the canned goods and hoarding them, they too became rationed. Now, rationing something like sugar is very easy. You get 4.5 ounces per week. Simple as that. But rationing something like canned food is a little bit more difficult. First of all, it's all different sizes, and does a can of tomato soup equal the same as a can of green beans? What if you don't like tomato soup? It just became much more complicated. Luckily, Britain, who had been rationing for several years at this point, already had a system that the US could look at as a model, and that was the points system. Every person in the US, regardless of age, received an allotment of red and blue points. Red were used for meat, dairy, and fats, and blue were used for canned and bottled goods as well as baby food. Each week you had a certain amount of points that you could use, and you had to use those in conjunction with money to actually buy the product itself, so they also started putting price caps on pretty much every item in the country. The system was clunky and complex and confusing for many people, so the government started putting out these newsreels to kind of try to explain it, and one of my favorites has a narrator who sounds like a cartoon gangster from the 1940s, and it's funny because he even kind of admits that it's a terribly confusing system, and he says that in comparison, this makes filling out income taxes strictly for amateurs. And there were lots of people who now wish they hadn't played hooky when the teacher was giving out with addition and subtraction. But of course, if you don't figure right, you have nothing to chew on but fresh vegetables, which is hay strictly for citizens who chew their cuds, or maybe rabbits. And this is just one reason why people did not like the rationing system. But most people realized there is a war on, and I gotta do my part. And so they accepted rationing, even though they were always kind of grumbling about it. But in 1943, the government tried to explain how important it was, saying rationing is essentially democratic. It protects the little man who is unable to pay exorbitant prices for articles of which limited quantities exist. Basically, rationing was the only way to make it fair for everyone and to keep down what could be rampant inflation. There were ways, though, to kind of get around some of the rationing rules, and that was simply to eat more foods that didn't require ration points, because not everything required points. Pretty much all fresh vegetables and fruits were never rationed. The canned versions were, because those were being sent overseas, but you can't really send like a fresh zucchini to Germany. It's just not gonna last. So fresh vegetables, have as many as you want. And that kind of went for most fresh foods. Fresh milk was never rationed, though processed milk products like cheese or evaporated milk or butter, those were rationed. Though if you did ever want your cheese fix, you could eat Kraft macaroni and cheese because you could get 2 boxes for only 1 ration point. And for getting the most out of your butter, there were numerous recipes that would help you stretch what you had, like mixing butter with gelatin and milk, neither of which required ration points. One of the few fresh foods that was rationed was meat, especially beef, which was one of the most costly items, both in money and in points. That's why there are so many recipes from this period for like mock meats. Like the one that we're making today, the emergency steak, is using lesser quality meats to mimic a better cut of meat. And then there were recipes that just tried to kind of replace meat altogether. Like one for baked peanuts, a meat alternative, which included peanuts, tomatoes, and molasses that was baked in a dish. This wasn't so much to mimic the taste or texture of meat, nobody was pretending that it was, but it was meant to mimic the nutritional value that you would get if you were to eat a sirloin. But even those foods that were not rationed could still be very difficult to get. Like for the entirety of the war, eggs were incredibly hard to find. So you have a lot of recipes from this period for eggless cakes. Because of all these reasons, people started raising and growing their own food at home. People would raise chickens and rabbits, especially in the city, and if you had a little bit more space, a lot of people would have goats or pigs or even cattle. And then there was the Victory Garden. Now again, this is something that the US was able to look across the pond to Britain because the British had been building Victory Gardens for a while, though actually both in the US and in Britain they had done this back in World War I. But World War II really saw the Victory Garden come to life. The government put out calls for everyone who had a patch of dirt or even available space on their roof to begin gardening their own fruits and vegetables at home. And by May 1943, there were 12 million Victory Gardens growing in America's cities and another 6 million on unused farmland. Eleanor Roosevelt even planted one on the White House lawn. Cities converted parks to be community-run Victory Gardens, like the lawns of Riverside Park in New York City, the Boston Common, and portions of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And in an era before you could just watch a YouTube video if you wanted to learn how to grow a green bean, they would put out books like the ABC of Victory Gardens to teach us city dwellers how best to turn your backyard into an instrument of war. And I say that because that is how the government sold these gardens, as an instrument of war. A Victory Garden is like a share in an airplane factory. It helps win the war and it pays dividends too. By 1944, Victory Gardens were producing about as many fruits and vegetables as the commercial farms of the country, which is pretty darn impressive. What I found interesting is that there wouldn't have actually been such a need for these Victory Gardens had the government not kind of shot themselves in the foot right from the get-go. See, the vast majority of certain fruits and vegetables were being grown in California, Oregon, and Washington state, and many of the farms were owned by Japanese Americans. For instance, a full half of the tomatoes and 95% of snap peas were grown just by Japanese American farms. And so when FDR signed Executive Order 9066 and sent many of those same growers to inland internment camps, over 6,100 farms were taken, but many lay fallow due to a lack of labor. But since those who had been sent to those camps knew so much about farming, the Victory Gardens that they set up at these Japanese internment camps turned out to be some of the most productive in the entire country. And I would actually love to do a whole video just on what they ate at these Japanese internment camps. So if that's something that you would be interested in, let me know, and I'll make it into a video. Now, while most Americans were growing their own fruits and vegetables, raising livestock, and accepting the nature of rationing with as much dignity as they could muster, there were, of course, some who thought that they were above the rules and didn't play fair, and this led to a thriving black market. This usually took the form of a consumer overpaying the monetary value of a certain product and not giving the grocer or whoever it was any ration stamps. You know, a little under the table. I'll pay you double, but no stamps. Unfortunately, the person who was taking this money had to turn in those stamps if they wanted to keep being resupplied, and so this led to counterfeit stamps, stealing different stamps, or they would have to ask other people who didn't use all of their stamps to give them theirs. And that's why the government said that any unused stamps that you have at a certain end of a period, you should destroy. Now, there was, of course, a social stigma against this. You know, why should I have to play by the rules if you're not? But since everyone kind of hated rationing, it wasn't that uncommon. They say that a full 17% of the meat that was being sold in the US at the time was being sold via the black market. And these people who were doing this were not called bootleggers like they were during Prohibition, but meatleggers. And they were put on the same plane as spies and saboteurs. There isn't any great difference. They're all helping the enemy. But I assure you, I am no meatlegger. I purchased my ground beef on the up and up. The ground beef that I am using to make my emergency steak, which should be ready to eat. And here we are, emergency steak from the World War II home front. I mean, it kind of looks like a steak, kind of, if you don't look too closely, you squint. It's pretty cool, actually, and it smells good. Smells like meatloaf. Pretty sure it's gonna taste like meatloaf because looking back, it's kind of a lot like meatloaf. Here we go. That is pleasantly delightful. It does kind of taste like meatloaf, but a little bit different. I was thinking that it wasn't going to have a lot of flavor because there isn't a lot of spice or anything in there, but it actually has a really good amount of flavor. Maybe the Wheaties really add something. I mean, I think you could put like a sauce with it, but I don't think you really need it. It's really good as is. Emergency steak. Very nice. Now, the rationing of meat pretty much ended with the end of the war, I think shortly thereafter, and most of the rationing ended at the end of the war or shortly thereafter. But there was one ingredient that was rationed all the way until 1947, and it was the ingredient that had been the very first to be rationed, and that is sugar. So pretty crazy that it was still being rationed 2 years after the end of the war. But that is nothing in comparison with what Great Britain had to go through. They were still rationing certain ingredients, meat being one of them, until 1954, 9 years after the end of the war. So America had it pretty good in comparison. But I will touch on England or Great Britain and how they dealt with the home front and rationing and living on the home front, because they were actually part of the war. Battle of Britain, all that rot. So probably won't be the next one that I do in this series, or it might be, maybe next month. Not sure, don't hold me to it, but make sure to keep watching and it'll pop up one of these days, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.